Get your thoughts. Gary O'Donoghue joining us there from Minneapolis. Let's pick up on some of those issues that Gary raised and talk to Dr Floyd Millen, a former advisor to London's Metropolitan Police Authority and an expert in police reform and accountability. Thanks so much for joining us. Can I ask you firstly to put this verdict into context, because it's the first of its kind, isn't it?
Hi, Lucy. Yes, this is a paradigm shift in policing in the USA, and it sets a new bar in terms of police accountability and the rights of citizens to get redress.
Can I ask you the same question that I asked Gary, because there is so much expectation now around what will happen next, so much talk of change and reform. What's the most important thing that you think should happen now?
I think the most important thing is the criminal justice system to align itself with the mores that have now been established. Citizens have called out for change, good police officers have called out for change, but the police have something called qualified immunity, which is now, as a result of the George Floyd Justice Policing Act, is beginning to be reviewed and looked at. So the criminal justice system, the ways of behaving in policing needs to follow suit now. And I think the critical thing is that there is no longer a presumption that officers will get away with committing death of individuals in custody, or be able to run carte blanche against the system, which other citizens are required to uphold or be subject to.
I mean, this verdict does start to chip away at that system that has normalised brutality against black people, but systems are so hard to break, particularly in a country the size of the US. Do you think it's possible?
I do. In my book, Police Reform and Political Accountability, I chart the journey of policing from 1607 to 2016 in the UK and the USA, where I compare the two systems. And it really is about hearts and minds. I think the first thing, if one were to be really radical, one would ask that the police unilaterally disarm themselves in the USA. That would be a radical move, but essentially it would only just push the issue further down, i.e. tasers would then become the issue and people would still die as a result of being tasered. So it is about hearts and minds. It's about the good cops, call into account the bad cops. And what we see too many times is that the good cops, in my book, I talk about the good cops being neutered, unable to speak out. Derek Chauvin was not the only officer there at the time, but he was the most senior of the three officers there. So the other officers should have pulled him back and reined him in. The act that the US president is pushing through, the George Floyd Act, is looking at patterns of behavior where officers have a pattern of behavior, they can indict them on that. They're also looking at having a federal register of misconduct from officers. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the qualified immunity is being looked at, as well as a number of other things. So there can be change, but it requires policymakers to be in lockstep with the feeling across the world that we can no longer tolerate this level of crime.
And just briefly, Floyd, how do you think police officers are feeling in the US today? What emotion are they feeling, and how deep is their desire for change?
I think some officers will feel dejected that one of theirs has been brought to book, but I do believe they will be in the minority, although the police unions tend to be very adamant in defending every officer. I think those officers of good countenance and of good character would say, at last, they see themselves as the citizen and the citizen as them. We are the symbiotic whole. So the good officers will be saying, at last. The bad officers and the police unions, I'm afraid, will maintain their ground and maintain their position. So again, this requires the federal system to be stronger, to bring accountability, and to bring in those practices which have caused a lot of these issues, such as no-knock warrants, such as chokeholds, which are now beginning to be seen as an anathema to good policing.
Dr. Millen.
I think finally, Lucy, I think the militarization of the police in the USA needs to be brought to a halt. And I believe Joe Biden is really across the issues on this.
Really interesting to talk to you, Dr. Millen. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Let's take you to Russia.